Welcome to the fifth session in this series on conducting literature reviews. In this session, we will focus on how you go about organizing a review. Just to quickly recap what we've done so far, we looked at how you go about motivating the review, we looked at how you define the search protocol, we looked at how you present the research profile, identify the themes, some of the coding procedures, and identifying gaps in the literature and putting together a framework or a future research agenda that can serve as guidance for future research. Now, now that you've actually synthesized the literature, you've done all of this, it's important that you start to organize what you found and what you want to put forth through a review article. And in this session, we will look at how you go about organizing it. Now, the basic outline of a review article, right? Predominantly, you will have reviews consisting of three basic elements. The first is the introduction, which is where you motivate the review. You give a snapshot of what is happening as far as this topic is concerned and the focal constructs within the review. The body, that's where you go into a discussion of the sources, the search protocol, and the themes that you identify, the methodology that you've adopted, and all of that. And lastly, conclusions and recommendations, where you're trying to make it more actionable in terms of, say, putting forth the future research agenda and also discussing some of the implications of the study and concluding it. Now, let's look at each of these steps in detail. Firstly, when we talk about structuring the introduction, there are about 8 steps that typically go into the introduction. We will take some examples to explain each of these steps so that becomes a lot clearer to you. Now, the first 3 steps, defining the concept, emphasizing the importance, and offering examples that can support the importance in terms of why is it significant. For example, we look at this article on the right. It defines fake news on the top, and it writes certain instances in terms of what's the impact of fake news been. And there are also examples that you will find here in terms of supporting the significance of the topic. Moving further, yet another thing that literature reviews will typically have to do within the introduction is to discuss what prior reviews, if any, in this field have discussed and what have they lacked in terms of what have they overlooked. And then you present the research question or the objectives that serve as guiding principles for the rest of the review. And then you also discuss how you go about addressing these research questions. Now, going back to an illustration here, if you look at the right, the authors discuss some of the attempts that have happened in this area in terms of capturing or synthesizing the extant literature on fake news. And with that, they present the research questions. They also discuss why a choice of a certain review, in this case, integrative review, is best suited to address these research questions and what happens in terms of the methodology that is adopted to address these research questions. Once you've done that, while you obviously detail it out in terms of the results and the contribution, the implications, further down in the paper, it's very important that you provide a snapshot in terms of what you found, what you contributed, what some of the implications of your study have been. Which is where, to take an illustration once again, in this article, the authors discuss that they uh, reviewed 81 research articles from 1992 and what were the results that they found, what is the novelty of the study, and how the rest of the paper is actually organized. So that kind of wraps up the introduction, and someone who's just reading the introduction is able to get a clear snapshot of what is happening in this paper. Moving further, once you've completed the introduction, you move on to the background. When we talk about the background, just like the introduction, there are about 5 steps that you need to follow. And we will again, as we've done in the past, give you examples and illustrations that can make a lot of this clear. Providing an overview of the key concepts. Now, you would have defined it already within the introduction. but it's important that you dedicate certain sections to talking about what these have, what literature has spoken about these topics in detail. Now, for example, when you look at some of these illustrations, they talk about what fake news and false narratives have been in the literature, some key definitions, and some of the inconsistencies in definitions of fake news, and so on and so forth. Now, beyond offering an overview of the key concepts, it's also important that you highlight the importance of the current review. Now, in this context, if you take the examples on the right, you will notice that the authors say that the phenomenon is new, it is fragmented, so and empirical research is scarce. So broadly, they are suggesting that there is a need for a review in this regard. Now, in the third step, you leverage them to establish the contours for the review. Now, right, so you have looked at the constructs, you've highlighted the importance of the review, and that helps you set the contours in terms of what are you going to discuss as part of the review. In this regard, if you look at the illustration, so the authors over here, they say that attempts to explain sustainability and associated activities have run into definitional issues. And then uh, they talk about defining the contours of the review. And what they say over here is the formulation of the SDGs was based on the three pillars, and hence the three pillar paradigm, which continues to gain widespread traction along with the SDGs, form the basis for defining the contours of sustainability in our study. So you have now not just defined the key constructs, you've highlighted the significance, and you've established the scope of the review. Most important is to call out any prior reviews and highlight any trends and gaps that you found within the literature. Now, if you look at this, there is a section that is dedicated within this paper on analyzing prior reviews, and the authors go about highlighting key trends in the past reviews. Now, that sets the stage for the current review. But after you've done this, do not stop at just discussing it. It's very important that you summarize it, right? So if somebody is not able to read through the entire background section, but is only able to read through the end of the section, the person should be able to get a clear perspective of what has happened within the background section. So it's very important you summarize what you found, what you defined, what were some of the shortcomings in the prior reviews, and what does the current review do. Now, if you look at the right, they do that in this article where they say, despite the looming threat, growing scholarly interest, literature at the intersection of sustainability, innovations, and fake news, it's fragmented, and no attempt has been made to organize the literature to the best of our knowledge. And the gaps that they've called out already leads them to conduct a review, not just do that, but also organize the crucial insights and advance intellectual knowledge through a conceptual framework that kind of sets the stage for future research. So this broadly forms the background section of your paper. Now the third of the sections is the methodology, wherein you're designing the search protocol, you're evaluating alignment, you keep going back to your research objectives, right? So it's important that you constantly reminding yourself of what the objectives of the research were, and your search protocol is aligned with that, including the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And once you've done that, you develop a research profile and you identify the themes. Now, designing the search protocol, right? Clearly call out in terms of what the search protocol is, what databases the authors over here they discuss what databases they chose, how did they define the keywords, and all of that. And in fact, even provide a flowchart of how they went about filtering these articles till the time they landed on the final corpus. In terms of evaluating alignment with research objectives, it's important that you not just state these inclusion and exclusion criteria, but you also discuss how these were leveraged in the filtration process in terms of reducing the entire count of articles and identifying the final corpus for your review. The third of them is the research profile. We've talked about some of these descriptive data that you present at the outset before you even start discussing some of the themes, the gaps, and the future research agenda. That is where you present some of the findings, initial findings of the review in terms of how many were empirical, just present a word cloud, talk about any theories that have been used, countries that that the research is focused on in terms of sampling processes, so on and so forth. Last of them is discuss how you went about identifying the themes, discuss some of the coding processes that you used, and what were the themes that eventually you landed on basis the approach that you took for identifying the themes. And if you look at the illustration on the right, they discuss how they evaluated this corpus of articles, the approaches that were followed, and how they landed on the final set of themes. Now, it's very important that now that you've identified themes, dedicate a section as much as possible to just discussing the literature across each theme, right? So what happens over here is you've talked about the themes, you discuss the literature as in terms of what has happened in this thematic area, what literature has spoken about as far as this theme is concerned. That is a little narrative in nature, but gives the reader a good sense of how the field has panned out and how topics have either evolved in the context of research in that particular area. And if you look at some of the illustrations, that's what the articles do. Highlighting the gaps. Try and dedicate another section to gaps in the literature. If you look at uh, not just gaps in the overall literature, but also discuss any gaps in empirical literature, if the review also includes non-empirical material in terms of, say, domain-related imbalances, inconsistencies, a lack of explicit references to the nature of innovation, so on and so forth. That's what the research gaps are being called out as far as this article is concerned, and gaps in the empirical literature as well. Now, this is the most important part of the paper where you're developing a future research agenda. And like we discussed, right? Broadly, you will find one or more of these when we speak of future research agenda in the papers. The first of them being that you put forth a conceptual framework based on whatever you've reviewed that serves as uh, guidance for future research, which researchers could take and then develop further models on. Yet another way to put forth a future research agenda is research questions, where you could ideally organize these research questions by themes. And also, not just stop at research questions, but you can also briefly discuss how, by addressing these research questions, researchers could contribute to literature. Now, for example, if you look at the illustration, we're talking about theme one, prevalence of fake news around sustainability issues. There are a set of three or more research questions that are presented in this area, and how does it contribute to the literature? The last of them is propositions. This is taking it a notch higher, where you're setting a actionable research agenda, where some clear propositions that could be taken forward as part of any future research in terms of operationalizing the constructs and evaluating whether evaluating these propositions. Now, that could actually be much more actionable than either putting just a conceptual framework or research questions. That's probably one of the best ways to put forth a research agenda. Now, contributions and implications. There are several ways to do that. You can talk about theoretical contributions when when you're focused on a specific domain, let's say marketing, information systems, and so on. It may be a good idea to even just discuss what some of the implications and contributions to a particular domain are. In this context, we're talking about implications to IS research and some of the practical contribution implications, right? So it's not always that you will find practical implications as part of a review paper, but if you think that the review could actually offer certain implications and also contribute to practice, I think it is important that you discuss it, call it out as part of some of the closing sections of your paper beyond the discussion area. Conclusion and limitations. It's very important that you state some limitations that could potentially be anchored in future studies, because there are definitely going to be some limitations. Maybe you excluded gray literature. Maybe your search protocol could be further enriched. Maybe there are other databases that could possibly be incorporated. Given the time frame is constantly evolving, there may be other literature that could be incorporated to provide richer insights, so on and so forth. But when you conclude the study, it's very important you summarize the study with absolute brevity, conclude in terms of what you found and how you are setting a future research agenda. Even before that, you want to discuss about what motivated the study and what did you do as part of the study and what did you contribute to theory, research, and practice. Leaving the abstract to the end, right? So once you've done that, it may be essential that you craft a very impactful abstract which talks about the problem statement. What did you address through the review? What did you find? How many articles did you review? What did you find? What was the contribution to, what is the theoretical contribution that you are making through this review? That kind of motivates readers to go and deep dive into what you've researched or reviewed, and also the implications to research and practice, and ensure that the keywords that you also state as part of the abstract capture the main essence of the review. Validate. I think one of the key things that is very essential is keep going back to the research objectives all through the entire review process. Keep going back and validate whether you've addressed the research objectives and questions that were raised at the outset of the study. When you go back to the discussion, ensure that it is addressing, because you've already called out some shortcomings of prior reviews. It's important that you validate whether your discussion is addressing them. And most important is to ensure that there is consistency in what you're discussing within the introduction, in the discussion section, conclusion, and abstract, so that the narrative is very consistent and they're all aligned with one another and they're not talking different things. So that alignment is very essential in terms of leading to a coherent narrative. All right, now a checklist for self-validation. Once you've organized the paper, it's very important that you go back and check if the sections have been created as outlined here. This is only a guidance. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule in terms of how you organize, but this is just a suggestion in terms of how you could organize the review, and ensure that there is consistency in what you've spoken of in the introduction with what you've discussed in the discussion section and in the conclusion sections. Also validate if there is a contribution, a theoretical contribution, especially that the review is making, and focus on your specific discipline and understand and probe and think about what are some of the key implications that the review is making to your discipline. Let's say it's marketing, HR, information systems, um, so on and so forth. So a quick recap of what we discussed in the session. We looked at the basic outline of a review paper. What are some of the key sections and how do you structure each of these sections? And most importantly, how do you keep reminding yourself of what you've done, validating it, and ensuring that there is a coherent narrative in terms of the sections being aligned with one another?